Victoria Sterling adjusted her Hermes blazer as she glanced at her Rolex. Another power lunch awaited. Across the bustling café, her 6-year-old daughter Sophie sat quietly coloring, her small world painted in silent strokes, while expensive tutors and speech therapists failed to breach the barrier between them. The child dropped her crayon box, colors scattering like broken promises across the hardwood floor. Before Victoria could react, calloused hands appeared, belonging to a man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, his own boy beside him. Then something impossible happened. Rough fingers began to dance through the air, and Sophie's eyes lit up like Christmas morning for the first time in months. Victoria's coffee cup trembled in her manicured hands as she watched her daughter's face transform, animated by a language she had never bothered to learn. I never thought I'd see her smile like that again. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Central Perk Café, casting golden streaks across the polished tables, where Seattle's business elite conducted their daily rituals. Victoria Sterling had claimed her usual corner table by 10:30, laptop open, phone buzzing with the relentless demands of her fintech empire. At 38, she had built Sterling Innovations from a garage startup into a $100 million company. But success had come with a price she was only beginning to understand. Sophie sat across from her, a delicate 6-year-old with Victoria's same determined jawline and expressive brown eyes. The child's coloring book lay open to a page of butterflies, each wing carefully filled with precise strokes of purple and gold. She worked in complete silence, as she had since birth, not by choice, but by circumstance. The doctors had delivered their verdict 2 years ago. Congenital hearing loss, severe to profound. Victoria glanced up from her screen, watching her daughter's small fingers grip the crayon with the same intensity she herself brought to board meetings. The guilt hit her like it always did, sharp and sudden. How many specialists had she hired? Yet here they sat, mother and daughter, separated by a chasm neither knew how to cross. Their conversations consisted of simple gestures and frustrated expressions. Sophie's crayon slipped from her fingers, rolling across the table and onto the floor. As Victoria reached down to retrieve it, she noticed something that made her pause. Her daughter wasn't looking at the fallen crayon. Her attention was fixed on something behind Victoria's shoulder. The child's eyes had widened with an expression Victoria had never seen before, pure fascination mixed with hope. Victoria turned to follow her daughter's gaze and saw a man she hadn't noticed before. He sat 3 tables away, sharing hot chocolate with a boy who looked to be around 8 years old. The man was perhaps 35, with weathered hands that spoke of physical work rather than boardroom negotiations. His flannel shirt was clean but faded. His jeans showed honest wear. Everything about him screamed blue collar, everything that Victoria's world had trained her to overlook. But it wasn't the man that had captured Sophie's attention. It was his hands. The stranger's fingers moved through the air in fluid, graceful patterns. He was signing to his son, and the boy was signing back with animated enthusiasm. Their conversation flowed like music made visible, a dance of communication that spoke of years of practice and deep understanding. Sophie had somehow knocked over her box of crayons in her excitement, sending colors cascading across the hardwood floor like a rainbow explosion. Before Victoria could react, the man with the calloused hands was there, kneeling beside their table. His son followed, and together they began gathering the scattered crayons. Then something extraordinary happened. The man looked up at Sophie, and his hands began to move. Victoria watched in stunned silence as this stranger began to communicate with her daughter in a language Victoria had never bothered to learn. Sophie's face transformed. The careful, guarded expression she wore in public melted away, replaced by wonder and joy. Her small hands moved tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but to Victoria it felt like watching a miracle unfold. Sophie was talking, really talking, to another human being for the first time in her young life. The man gathered the last of the crayons, signed something that made Sophie giggle, then returned to his table. Victoria sat frozen, her coffee growing cold in her trembling hands. In 30 seconds, a complete stranger had accomplished what years of expensive therapy had failed to achieve. "Excuse me," Victoria found herself saying, her voice shakier than she intended. The man looked up from his table, his expression polite but slightly wary. "I'm sorry to bother you, but what you just did for my daughter—" "It's no trouble," he replied, his voice carrying a slight drawl. "Sophie seems like a bright kid. How long has she been signing?" The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. Sophie hadn't been signing at all. We're still learning," Victoria managed. Something shifted in the man's expression, a recognition that spoke of understanding deeper than sympathy. "It takes time," he said gently. "But she's got the foundation. Kids pick it up fast once they get started." Victoria wanted to ask a dozen questions, but her phone buzzed with an incoming call she couldn't ignore. By the time she finished the brief conversation, the man and his son were gone, leaving only the memory of Sophie's transformed face. That evening, Victoria sat in her home office researching American Sign Language classes in Seattle. She had built an empire on innovative communication technology, had revolutionized how financial data flowed between institutions, yet she couldn't properly communicate with her own daughter. As midnight approached, Victoria registered for a beginner's ASL class and spent another hour researching the best resources for learning sign language quickly. Days passed without another sighting. Victoria threw herself into learning sign language with the same intensity she brought to every challenge. She hired a private tutor and practiced basic signs during conference calls. Sophie watched these early attempts with gentle amusement, correcting her mother's clumsy finger movements with the patience of someone accustomed to being misunderstood. It was during their 4th consecutive morning at Central Perk that Victoria spotted him again. The man sat at a different table, closer to the window, his son engrossed in homework. Victoria felt her heart rate spike as she debated whether to approach. Before she could lose her nerve, she walked over to their table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did for my daughter last week. I'm Victoria, by the way. Victoria Sterling." The man looked up, and for just a moment, something flickered across his features. Surprise, recognition, something darker that was quickly concealed. "Ben Carter," he replied, extending his hand. "This is my son Jake." Victoria smiled at the boy and attempted a simple hello in sign language. Jake's face lit up with delight at her effort, and he responded with enthusiasm that Ben translated. "He says your signing is getting better, but you need to relax your shoulders. He also wants to know if Sophie is here today." The next 30 minutes passed like a dream. Sophie and Jake communicated with the easy friendship of children who recognize kindred spirits. Ben patiently translated when needed and offered gentle corrections to Victoria's signing attempts. For the first time since Sophie's diagnosis, Victoria felt like she was witnessing her daughter's true personality emerge. Playful, curious, surprisingly funny. When their gathering came to an end, Ben pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "That's the name of Jake's ASL tutor," he explained. "She's excellent with kids, and she does family sessions." Victoria looked at the card, then back at Ben. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Ben's expression grew thoughtful as he watched Jake and Sophie saying goodbye in sign language. "Because 3 years ago, someone helped us when we needed it most. And because Sophie deserves to have her mother speak her language." As they parted ways, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with genuine connection to another human being. What she couldn't see was the internal storm Ben was weathering as he walked away. Ben remembered the day he had been called into Victoria's office 4 years ago. She had been newly promoted to CEO, and his marketing campaign had been expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. Victoria had been clinical in her assessment. His position was being eliminated. The timing couldn't have been worse. His wife Sarah had just been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Their cafe meetings became a weekly tradition. Sophie and Jake would work on homework together, while Victoria and Ben discussed the challenges of single parenthood and the unexpected joys of watching their children thrive. Victoria found herself looking forward to these conversations in ways that surprised her. Ben's perspective on life was refreshingly different from the achievement-focused mindset that dominated her world. He spoke about success in terms of daily moments rather than quarterly goals. He measured wealth in time spent with Jake rather than dollars accumulated. It was a worldview that both challenged and attracted Victoria, forcing her to examine her own priorities. But beneath their growing friendship lay secrets and histories that neither had fully revealed. The woman Ben was getting to know was vulnerable, funny, fiercely protective of her daughter, and genuinely committed to becoming a better parent. This Victoria Sterling bore little resemblance to the cold, corporate strategist who had once dismissed him without hesitation. The turning point came on a Thursday morning in late October, when Victoria arrived at the cafe to find Ben and Jake having an intense conversation in sign language. Jake's shoulders were hunched with obvious distress. "Is everything okay?" Victoria asked, noting the tension. "Jake's having some trouble at school," Ben explained. "There's a new kid who's been making fun of the way he talks." Victoria felt her protective instincts flare immediately. Over the past 2 months, Jake had become almost like a second child to her. "What can we do?" Ben studied her face carefully. "Actually, there might be something. Jake's school is having a diversity awareness presentation next week. I was thinking Sophie and Jake could present together about deaf culture and sign language." "Of course," Victoria said immediately. "When and where?" "Roosevelt Elementary, next Thursday at 2 o'clock. Ben's voice was steady, but Victoria caught something that might have been relief in his expression. "I should probably mention that it's a pretty affluent school district, lot of tech industry families, business executives." Something cold settled in Victoria's stomach, though she couldn't identify why. "That's fine. I'm used to those environments." The presentation went better than Victoria had dared to hope. Sophie and Jake worked together to demonstrate basic signs, taught the class finger spelling, and answered questions with natural patience. Victoria found herself moved by her daughter's confidence as she explained what it was like to experience the world without sound. But it was during the question and answer session that everything changed. A well-dressed woman raised her hand. "What do you do for work, Mr. Carter? I feel like I recognize you from somewhere." Victoria felt Ben stiffen beside her, saw something like resignation cross his features. "I do carpentry work now, mostly custom furniture, but I used to work in tech before life took us in a different direction." The woman persisted. "What company? My husband works for Microsoft, and I swear you look familiar." Victoria's blood turned to ice as Ben's eyes met hers across the small auditorium. In that moment, she knew. Before he said the words, she knew that their meeting had never been coincidental. "Sterling Innovations," Ben said quietly, his gaze never leaving Victoria's face. "I used to work for Sterling Innovations." The room seemed to tilt around Victoria as memories came flooding back. Benjamin Carter, the marketing director with the innovative campaigns and the sick wife, the man she had laid off during her first month as CEO when she was desperate to prove herself capable of making hard decisions. She remembered him now, younger, more polished, wearing suits instead of flannel shirts. His expensive campaigns had failed to prevent a major client defection at the worst possible time. Victoria had been facing a board that questioned her ability to lead, and eliminating underperforming departments had been the fastest way to demonstrate her decisiveness. Ben Carter had been collateral damage in her fight for credibility, and she had justified it as necessary for the greater good of the company. She had never thought about him again after that day. When the session ended, Victoria found herself frozen in place. Sophie was chattering excitedly with Jake, but Victoria couldn't bring herself to move or speak. Ben approached slowly. "We should probably talk," he said quietly. But before Victoria could respond, Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve and signed a question that cut through Victoria's paralysis. "Why do you and Ben look so sad? Did we do something wrong?" Looking down at her daughter's concerned face, then across at Jake's equally worried expression, Victoria realized that whatever reckoning was coming between her and Ben, two innocent children were caught in the middle. The drive back to the cafe felt like the longest 20 minutes of Victoria's life. Ben had suggested they meet there after dropping the children at aftercare, and Victoria had agreed despite every instinct telling her to run. Central Perk was quieter in the late afternoon. Victoria chose a table in the back corner and waited with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she couldn't bring herself to drink. When Ben walked in, he looked older than she remembered from just hours before. "How long have you known?" Victoria finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I recognized you the first day in the cafe." Ben replied, his tone neutral but not unkind. "You look exactly the same as you did 4 years ago." Victoria flinched. "Then why help us? Why be kind to Sophie? Why teach me to sign?" Ben was quiet for a long moment. "Because Sophie reminded me of Jake in those early days after the accident, and because my wife made me promise something before she died, that I wouldn't let bitterness destroy the good parts of who I used to be." "What promise?" "That I'd find ways to help other people, even when it was hard to do. Sarah used to say that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick." Victoria felt tears threatening. "Ben, I need you to know that I remember that day. I remember you asking for more time, telling me about your wife's condition. I remember choosing to ignore it because I thought I had to prove I could make hard decisions." "I know. I've made a lot of difficult choices as CEO, but that one has haunted me more than you'll ever know." Ben nodded slowly. "I spent a long time being angry about that. The job loss meant we had to change insurance plans right when Sarah needed experimental treatments. We lost the house, watched our savings disappear." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "Oh God, Ben, I'm so sorry." "The thing is," Ben continued gently, "losing that job also meant I was home with Sarah during her last 6 months. If I'd still been working 70-hour weeks, I would have missed most of that time. And when the accident happened 8 months later, when Jake lost his hearing, I had to rebuild everything anyway." Victoria stared at him through tears. "Are you telling me you're grateful I destroyed your career?" "I'm telling you that life is more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves about villains and victims. You made a business decision that caused me tremendous hardship. But that hardship also led me to discoveries about strength and love that I never would have found otherwise." Their conversation was interrupted by Victoria's phone buzzing. Board meeting moved to 5 p.m. Crisis with Singapore client. Your presence required immediately. Victoria stared at the message, then at Ben's patient face. 6 months ago, she would have apologized and rushed to the office without a second thought. But today, she made a choice that surprised them both. She turned off her phone. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said. "Something about why your firing haunts me more than other difficult decisions." Victoria took a breath and began to tell Ben about inheriting her father's company, about feeling unprepared and questioned by the board, about making the decision to eliminate his department, not because it was right, but because it was hard, and she thought doing hard things would prove she belonged in that office. I sacrificed your family's stability to prove to a room full of men that I could be as ruthless as they were. She finished. Ben reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle despite everything, that Victoria felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. "There's something I need to tell you too," Ben said. "About Jake's accident. After Sarah died and I was unemployed, I started drinking. Not constantly, but enough that my judgment was impaired. The night of the accident, I had been at a bar. A drunk driver hit us, but my reaction time was slower than it should have been. I'll always wonder if my son lost his hearing because I wasn't the father he deserved that night." Victoria stared at him. "Ben, you can't blame yourself." "Can't I? You've spent 4 years blaming yourself for a business decision that was legal and rational. I've spent 3 years wondering if my poor judgment cost my son his hearing. We're both carrying guilt about choices that seemed reasonable at the time. So what do we do with that guilt? We learn from it. We make different choices going forward, and we forgive ourselves for being human." Ben squeezed her hand gently. "Victoria, I forgave you a long time ago, not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger was destroying my ability to be the father Jake needed." "Where does that leave us? Sophie and Jake are friends. They need each other." "Very carefully," Ben said with a slight smile. "And with a lot more honesty than we've been using. If we're going to be in each other's lives, and I think our kids have made that decision for us, then we need to be real with each other." Victoria nodded, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'd like that. The honesty, I mean. I don't need you to make amends, Victoria. I need you to be the mother Sophie deserves and the friend Jake values. Everything else is just old history." The children were waiting for them at Roosevelt Elementary, their faces bright with excitement. Sophie immediately began signing about their success, and Jake added his own commentary. Watching them together, Victoria realized that whatever complicated history existed between her and Ben, their children had found something pure in their friendship. As they walked toward their cars, Sophie signed a question that made both adults pause. "Are you and Ben friends now? Real friends like me and Jake?" Victoria looked at Ben, seeing hope and uncertainty in his expression. "Yes, sweetheart." Victoria signed back, her movements more confident than they had been weeks earlier. "We're working on being real friends." That evening, as she tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter signed something that made Victoria's heart skip. "I'm proud of you, Mama. You're learning my language. And now you and Ben don't have sad eyes anymore." The next few weeks brought a tentative new normal. Victoria and Ben met regularly at the cafe, but their conversations had evolved beyond sign language lessons. They talked about their different perspectives on success and happiness, about rebuilding life after loss. Victoria found herself looking forward to these meetings with anticipation that had nothing to do with business. Ben's insights challenged assumptions Victoria had held since childhood. He spoke about wealth in terms of time and relationships rather than market share. It was a worldview that both attracted and intimidated Victoria. The transformation in Victoria's relationship with Sophie was remarkable. As her signing improved, Sophie began to open up in ways Victoria had never imagined possible. The quiet, careful child was replaced by a vibrant, opinionated little girl with strong preferences about everything. But it was during a conversation on a rainy Thursday that Ben shared something that would challenge Victoria in new ways. "I've been thinking about going back to school," he said. "Getting certified to teach ASL, maybe working with deaf kids and their families." Victoria's business instincts immediately kicked in. She could solve this problem with a phone call, could offer Ben resources to remove every obstacle. But something in Ben's expression stopped her from making the offer immediately. "What's holding you back?" she asked instead. Jake, mostly. The program is full-time for 18 months, which means less income and more demands on my time. I don't want to put my dreams ahead of his stability. What does Jake think about the idea? Ben's smile was rueful. He thinks it's the best idea I've ever had. He's excited about the possibility of me working with other deaf kids. He even offered to get a job to help with expenses. He's 8 years old and wants to support his father's education dreams. Victoria laughed despite the seriousness. That sounds like Jake. If you knew it would work out, if you had a guarantee of success, would you do it? In a heartbeat. Then maybe the question isn't whether you can afford to take the risk. Maybe it's whether you can afford not to. Ben studied her face, surprised by her response. That's not what I expected you to say. I'm trying to learn from someone who's shown me that there are other ways to measure success. The conversation also forced Victoria to examine her own relationship with risk and change. When had she become so focused on certainty and control? When had she stopped believing that some things were worth pursuing without guarantees? The revelation that would change everything came through a child's innocent question on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Victoria and Sophie had joined Ben and Jake for a picnic in Discovery Park, one of many family outings that had become natural extensions of their friendship. The children were flying a kite that Ben had made with Jake, and Victoria was watching their collaboration with contentment. They're good together, Ben observed. Sophie brings out Jake's protective instincts, and Jake helps Sophie feel confident. I never thought I'd see her so free, Victoria replied. 6 months ago she was so careful all the time. Jake ran back to them with excitement, Sophie close behind. He signed something rapidly to Ben, who listened with growing interest. What's he saying? Victoria asked. He wants to know if Sophie can come to Deaf Camp with him this summer. They've been planning this for weeks. Victoria felt her protective instincts flare. Summer camp meant Sophie would be away from home, among strangers, in situations Victoria couldn't control. But then she saw Sophie's face, lit up with hope in a way Victoria had rarely seen, and realized her own fears were about to limit her daughter's possibilities again. Tell me about this camp, she said. The camp was a week-long program for deaf children and their families, designed to build confidence in deaf identity. Jake had attended the previous summer and talked about it for months as the best week of his life. Sophie was signing frantically, promising to be careful, to follow rules, to make Victoria proud. It's not about rules, sweetheart. Victoria signed back. It's about whether this is something you really want to do. Sophie's response was emphatic. Yes, she wanted to go more than anything. Okay, Victoria heard herself saying. If Jake's going and you think it would be good for Sophie, then let's look into it. The children's celebration was immediate and joyful, but it was Ben's quiet, I'm proud of you, that made Victoria's chest tighten with emotion. 3 days into Sophie's week at camp, Victoria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of spending the time on work, she called her assistant and announced she was taking her first real vacation in 6 years. She ended up driving to the Oregon coast, checking into a small bed and breakfast in Cannon Beach without reservations. For 3 days, she walked miles of pristine shoreline, read novels instead of business reports, and slowly remembered what it felt like to exist without an agenda. On her last evening, Victoria called Ben from the deck of her room, watching sunset paint the Pacific in gold and coral. "How's the vacation?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Terrifying and wonderful," she admitted. "I haven't done anything productive in 72 hours, and I think I'm starting to understand why that might be a good thing." "Any revelations?" "I think I've been so afraid of being useless that I forgot how to just be human. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. It's scary to discover that you're more than what you produce or achieve." "Ben," Victoria said, gathering courage she hadn't known she possessed. "When I get back and we pick up the kids from camp, would you like to have dinner? Just the two of us, I mean. Not as co-parents or friends helping each other, but as whatever we might be becoming." The silence lasted long enough for Victoria to wonder if she had misread everything. But when Ben finally spoke, his voice was warm with relief. "Victoria Sterling, are you asking me on a date?" "I believe I am, Ben Carter, though I should warn you that I'm completely out of practice." "Well then," Ben said, and Victoria could hear his grin. "It's lucky for both of us that I happen to know a thing or two about starting over." As Victoria hung up and watched the last light fade from the Oregon sky, she realized that everything she thought she knew about success, happiness, and second chances had been transformed by a chance encounter in a Seattle cafe. She had started this journey trying to learn her daughter's language, but she had ended up discovering her own voice instead. The woman who would drive back to Seattle tomorrow was not the same person who had watched Ben Carter help Sophie gather scattered crayons on that autumn morning. She was someone who had learned that strength could look like vulnerability, that success could be measured in moments rather than achievements, and that the most important conversations happened across cafe tables between two people brave enough to tell each other the truth. And for the first time in her carefully planned, strategically managed life, Victoria Sterling was excited to see what would happen next.